Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, Roger, go from them.
Good evening and welcome to the October 9, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward and I have Tina Stagg and Michael Abdullah here with me tonight, and we're all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get straight into some space news like we love to do. The Australian Prime Minister's recent trip to the United States has heralded a major deal for the Australian Space Agency and the nation's space industry more broadly. Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Minister for Industry, Science and Technology Karen Andrews jointly announced an investment in Australian space businesses and new technologies that will support NASA on its campaign to return to the Moon and travel to Mars. The Morrison government is positioning Australia with a $150 million investment in Australian businesses and technologies. The 5-year investment will see the Australian Space Agency foster new ideas and high-tech skilled jobs that will make Australian businesses a partner of choice to fit out NASA missions. The government's support means Australian businesses and researchers will have the opportunity to showcase their knowledge and capabilities in projects that can support NASA's Moon to Mars mission, such as Project Artemis and the Lunar Gateway. It will also support Australian businesses to become more competitive in international space supply chains and to increase Australia's share in a growing $350 billion global space market. The Australian Space Agency will work closely with NASA to identify how they can best support their missions after the signing of a joint statement of intent on expanding cooperation between the two agencies. And the federal government is surging towards unlocking the Australian space economy. Deep space exploration, Earth observation and debris tracking have been identified as key growth opportunities for Australia's space sector in a CSIRO report launched at the 18th Australian Space Research Conference in Adelaide. Following extensive consultations with industry, the Space A Roadmap for Unlocking Future Growth Opportunities for Australia report outlines how some of Australia's strengths and geographic advantages are key to enhancing the nation's share of the international space sector and growing the size of Australia's domestic space industry to $12 billion by 2030. The Space Roadmap presents 3 key areas for potential development, including supporting space exploration and deep space gateway habitats to safely conduct robotic and human missions, building capabilities in observing Earth from space, satellite communications and positioning, navigation and timing data, and taking advantage of Australia's geographic position in the Southern Hemisphere. The nation can further its work with international programs that track objects in space, manage space debris, and enable deep space communication. Additionally, the new roadmap identifies an ambitious plan to support international partners by developing and providing technological expertise to help establish a human base on the Moon. Meeting the challenge would involve building capabilities in autonomous robotic systems, in situ resource utilisation, habitat and life support, power and propulsion. And in more Australian space news, Black Sky Aerospace begins construction of an Australian launch facility. In the race to provide a launch facility for the burgeoning space industry in Australia, Black Sky Aerospace is reportedly miles ahead of its competition as construction kicks off at its Queensland facility. And this just after announcing that regulators have given the green light for Black Sky Aerospace, or BSA, to begin developing their solid rocket motor manufacturing facility. BSA has committed to an expansion of Australia's first privately owned commercial suborbital launch facility, complete with rooms for operations, storage, accommodation and even additional sealed runway for critical logistics. But in a twist, it is not actually BSA building the facility. a not-for-profit entity named Beyond the Blue Aerospace, will build and manage the property just outside of Goondiwindi in southeast Queensland. BSA Communications Manager Rob Libbo said Beyond the Blue Aerospace has been facilitating rocket launches throughout Australia for the better part of a decade and has been the connection between launch operators and government departments. A spokesman for BTBA, Lachlan Thomas, said the Funny Farm space, as the launch facility is to be known, will be available for space businesses to test propulsion systems and fly suborbital vehicles up to and above the carbon line. And in Australia East news, that's New Zealand, Rocket Lab's second launch site is nearing completion. The company recently announced it had installed the launch platform at Launch Complex 2, under construction at Wallops Island, Virginia in the US, and expected the pad to be completed by the end of this year or the first launch early next year. The complex will augment the existing Launch Complex 1 in New Zealand that has been used for all Electron launches up to date. And it's over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, space fans. Turning to NASA news, to NASA's Commercial Crew Program, Administrator Jim Bridenstine is not convinced commercial crew vehicles will be ready to carry astronauts in the next few months. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk recently said in an interview the Crew Dragon vehicle could be ready in 3 to 4 months. But Bridenstine, who criticised SpaceX for commercial crew delays before the company's Starship event, cast doubt on that schedule, in part because the company had yet to demonstrate its abort system, which suffered what he called a catastrophic failure in April, destroying a Crew Dragon capsule. Bridenstine also said Boeing's CST-100 Starliner was behind schedule and, combined with SpaceX's delays, could force NASA to buy more Soyuz seats in 2020, if any are available. Formal updates to commercial crew schedules will wait until NASA hires a new Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations, which Bridenstine said would be in the coming weeks or months. Meanwhile, an all-Russian crew could launch on a Soyuz spacecraft to the ISS next northern autumn, unless NASA needs a seat. Sergei Krikalev, Executive Director of Human Spaceflight at Roscosmos, said Russia plans to launch 3 cosmonauts on a Soyuz to the ISS. Soyuz flights have, since the station's beginnings, included Russian as well as American or other astronauts, particularly since Soyuz became the only means for crews to get to and from the station. The first all-Russian crew is dependent on NASA getting commercial crew vehicles in service, and Krikalev said continued delays could ruin those plans. To NASA's Moon program and the Lunar Gateway, the final version of a call for proposals for human lunar landers includes a loophole regarding the Lunar Gateway. NASA issued the solicitation for the Human Landing System procurement last Monday, with proposals due to the agency on November the 1st. One of the changes from earlier drafts is that companies can propose docking their landers directly within an Orion spacecraft rather than using the Gateway, at least for the initial lunar landing mission in 2024. But NASA still considers the Gateway essential to its long-term exploration plans and expects companies to use it for later missions. NASA awarded more than $40 million in contracts late last month for work on exploration-related technologies. The Tipping Point Awards from NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate are intended to support maturation of key technologies in areas from propellant production to avionics in support of missions to the Moon and Mars. Blue Origin received the largest contract, valued at $10 million, to carry out a ground demonstration of technology to liquefy and store hydrogen and oxygen propellant. SpaceX received a $3 million contract to develop coupler prototypes for in-space refuelling. Two of the companies with commercial lunar payload services contracts, Astrobotic and Intuitive Machines, also received contracts to work on related technologies. To the US Air Force, United Launch Alliance has received a $1.1 billion contract from the Air Force for the final 5 launches of the Delta IV Heavy rocket. The contract, announced last week, covers the launch operations costs for 5 classified NRO missions. The Air Force already had acquired 5 Delta IV Heavy rockets for those missions under previous contracts awarded to ULA in 2017 and 2018. The Air Force said the NRO missions were sole sourced to ULA because the Delta IV was determined to be the only rocket that could satisfy the demands, even as the Air Force says it wants to move away from sole sourcing and transition to a competitive launch procurement program. And over to Mike.
Thank you, Tina. And let's look at some Russian news. Russia plans to retire the Rocket small launch vehicle after a final launch next month. The November 29 launch from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome will place 3 GONETS communication satellites into low Earth orbit, although officials said the launch could slip to late December. The Rocket is a converted SS-19 ICBM that will be retired as Russia shifts to other vehicles like the Angara. And moving to India. India will conduct a test of satellite docking technologies next year. ISRO head K. Sivan said 2 experimental modules would be flown on a PSLV rocket next year and, once in orbit, would test docking with each other. Sivan said the test could support the eventual development of an Indian space station, a long-term goal of its human spaceflight program. And moving to Japan. A Japanese spacecraft last week released a small rover that will explore the surface of an asteroid. The Hayabusa 2 spacecraft released Minerva 2, which is descending slowly to the surface of the asteroid Ryugu. The deployment is one of the last major activities at the asteroid for Hayabusa 2, which will depart from the vicinity of Ryugu later this year to return the samples it collected to Earth. And moving to SpaceX. Elon Musk says SpaceX's first Starship prototype could fly in the next 2 months, with another reaching orbit in as little as 6 months. Musk giving a much-anticipated update recently on development of the next-generation reusable launch vehicle at SpaceX's South Texas test site, said that the vehicle could fly a suborbital test flight to 20 kilometres in 1 or 2 months, although the company first needs to get an FAA licence for it. Additional prototypes will be built rapidly, he claimed, allowing for an orbital test flight in as soon as 6 months and crewed flight sometime next year. SpaceX, though, is known for announcing aggressive schedules that later slip. Musk also defended the company from criticism by NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who noted that SpaceX was years behind schedule on commercial crew vehicles. Musk said that less than 5% of SpaceX's resources were currently going to Starship, with the bulk devoted to the Falcon launch vehicle and Dragon spacecraft. And looking at Blue Origin. Blue Origin may not fly people in space before the end of the year, as the company had previously planned. Blue Origin CEO Bob Smith, speaking at a conference last week, said the company tapped the brakes on its new Shepard suborbital vehicle as it worked to verify the vehicle is safe enough to carry people. While Smith didn't rule out flying people on the vehicle before the end of the year, he said it wasn't likely. Smith said Blue Origin would conduct at least 2 more uncrewed test flights, the first of which is scheduled for no earlier than November the 1st, based on an FCC licence application. And Virgin Galactic announced last week a contract with the Italian Air Force for a research flight on its Spaceship Two suborbital vehicle. The contract, signed at the Italian Embassy in Washington, covers a Spaceship Two flight no earlier than late next year that will carry 3 Italian crew members and a set of experiments. The flight will take place from Spaceport America, although Italy has expressed interest in eventually hosting Spaceship Two flights from an Italian airport. And back to you, Peter.
Well, thank you, Michael. And that's it for this week's Space News. Thank you, Tina, and we'll speak to you next week. Bye now.